Today, we will analyze an eye-opening video from ex-CIA Andrew Bustamante concerning effective decision-making process and manipulation through messaging and narratives. You are watching Tough Psychology. Let's get started.
Emotional decision-making is what the human brain wants to do. It wants to make emotional decisions because emotional decisions require less cognitive ability, less calories, less time. It's so much easier to just fall back on what you were conditioned as a kid to believe, what you have experienced as an adult, what your opinions are, what your friends say. It's just the easiest, fastest way to make a decision. The brain is inherently very conservative of its energy. We often joke that the brain is lazy. So the brain just jumps to conclusions. And when you give it a way of jumping to a conclusion, it likes that. It's like muscle memory. I'm a Christian, therefore I'm pro-life. So anytime you bring up anything Christian, I'm going to say pro-life. The brain loves that because it saves all this analysis and contextualizing and synthesis and information vetting. It saves itself all that trouble by just jumping to a conclusion. So you see information is presented to you in what form? In a way that triggers an emotional response. Even to your point about the whole Palestine and Hamas are presented in a way where it's hard to distinguish the difference between the two. I completely agree. The reason they are presented that way is to make it easy for the human brain in the target audience to leap to the conclusion that Palestine is Hamas. Hamas is Palestine. They are the same, which makes everything happening in Israel right now under the rubric of terrorism. If that's the narrative you want to portray, it's easy to get there when you don't differentiate, when you don't use subtlety and nuance to explain your information. As soon as you start to dig into the information, as soon as you start to map the battlefield, you start to see all the changes in the terrain. You start to see the tree line. You start to see the sand pits. You start to see the areas that are high ground and highest ground and how they're different from the low ground and the lowest ground. It takes that level of awareness to be able to really land on a meaningful decision. So the first thing to understand is that we decide, you, me, the smartest people, the dumbest people. It's irrelevant of your race, age, creed, or education level. We all, pink matter, brain matter, decide first and easily through emotions, through an emotional lens. It's sometimes called emotional reasoning. Emotion and reasoning are two different things. But when you reason through a lens of emotion, it's a cognitive distortion that we call emotional reasoning. Understanding that is kind of the first step.
Andrew Bustamante explains that smart people, especially those from the CIA, recognize that the human brain tends to be lazy and prefers making quick and simple decisions based on emotions. Therefore, if someone aims to manipulate people, they must evoke emotions in them.
And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
By doing so, people are less inclined to engage in critical thinking and analysis. So, if someone is pushing you to make a decision and you feel emotions, it probably means that this person is trying to manipulate you. Indeed, the entire advertising industry is built on understanding and leveraging human emotions to influence consumer behavior.
You've heard a lot of people talk about narrative, especially in politics. There's the liberal narrative, and there's the Republican narrative, and there's the conservative narrative, and the church narrative. And people talk a lot about narrative. Narrative is not the power in influence. The power in influence actually comes from messaging. It takes two steps to get to a narrative. It takes messaging first, and then messaging builds a narrative. If you think about messaging, messaging is supposed to be an emotional thing, just a statement, just a message, just like a text message. Are you afraid of being the kind of father that isn't present for your kids? That creates emotion in the right, ideologically predisposed person. There's no woman out there who's going to be motivated by that. She might be motivated to tell her partner about that, but it's not going to resonate with her like it resonates with me as a father of young children. But that's just the message. Then the narrative is not emotional in nature. The narrative is logical in nature. So you use an emotional message to communicate a logical narrative. Are you afraid of being the kind of father that's not present for your child? Oh man, that pulls at my heartstrings. Well, then all you have to do is sign up for this app that reminds you every Sunday to read your kids a story. And you're like, oh, that makes total sense. All I need is a reminder and I'm going to be a good dad. And that's messaging and narrative. The same thing happens in politics. The same thing happens in geopolitics. The same thing happens the whole world over. Because in the intelligence world, we understand messaging and narrative. We know how to use messaging and narrative. It's how you elect a president. It's the reason that Saudi Arabia went to war with Iran over Yemen. Everybody understands at a national security level the idea of creating a message or a narrative using emotional messaging.
Now, Watch a couple of examples of real political messages that triggered emotions and, with their logical narratives, led to severe consequences.
The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder. We will meet that threat now with our Army, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines, so that we do not have to meet it later with armies of firefighters and police and doctors on the streets of our cities.
As Commander-in-Chief, I face no greater decision than sending our military men and women into harm's way. And the United States should not and cannot intervene every time there's a crisis somewhere in the world. But I firmly believe that when innocent people are being brutalized, when someone like Gaddafi threatens a bloodbath that could destabilize an entire region, and when the international community is prepared to come together to save many thousands of lives, then it's in our national interest to act. And it's our responsibility. This is one of those times.
Once you see it, you can't unsee it. There's a simple solution to protect yourself from such manipulations. If you feel emotions, try to dig for more information as much as possible before making any decisions, despite what your own lazy brain tells you to do. Doing so will make it much harder for anybody to manipulate you. And it's tough psychology.